Greetings and welcome to Edgy Ideas, the podcast that explores what it means to live the good life and create the good society in our disruptive age. My name is Simon Western, and I will be talking to invited guests about diverse topics, exploring social conscious and unconscious dynamics and desires. Welcome everybody to this edition of Edgy Ideas podcast. Today my special guest is Anni Rowland-Campbell. Anni is a philanthropist and a web science practitioner. She is director of Interstitia, a global charity and social enterprise which focuses on helping to develop emerging stewards for the 21st century. For the past 2 decades, Anni has worked with board, senior leadership and management teams to help them become more digital savvy. And in 2017, she created Brave Conversations as a way to bring the conversations of the social machine to the general public. And Brave Conversations has been held all around the world, both face-to-face and online. Anni has many other positions, including being president of the Digital Enlightenment Foundation, a trustee of the Web Science Trust, and a non-executive director of Founders and Coders UK. Anni, you're very welcome to Edgy Ideas. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, Simon. And you're in the middle of a storm.
We are, yeah. I've just been swimming in the sea. It's been lovely. I live in Galway and I've just been a quick plunge in the sea, but the storm is breaking. The rain is coming.
Well, you see, this is lovely because if I was in Australia at the minute and we had a storm, we probably wouldn't be able to do this interview because the power would be down, the internet would be down. And, you know, I've had 2 trees on my house, so I might even have a tree down. You never know. So hopefully, certainly in London, it's hot and they're all running around getting their air conditioners and heaters. And as the Aussie in London, I'm sort of sitting here saying, yes, well, that's what you're going to need to do. So there we go.
Good. So, Anni, I want to talk to you about your insights into your work, helping people become digital savvy. What's your main kind of focus at the moment? What are you doing at the moment, which is inspiring you, which is kind of top of your agenda?
Well, Simon, I think, this word digitally savvy, or what a friend of mine and I, you know, we basically describe the fact that, and the work that we're doing, as that our machines are becoming smarter. And as our machines are becoming smarter, we as humans need to become a lot smarter in terms of how we use digital interaction technologies. And that's really what I do. It's what Brave Conversations is about. It's what my work as a philanthropist is about. And it's something that we've been trying to do for sort of 20 to 25 years. And I think there's a sense of urgency now because people are beginning to wake up and realize how powerful these technologies are, but also how, you know, insidious they are. So integrated into our lifestyles now that it's actually very hard to interact with the world now if you don't interact digitally.
So you've been at this for a long time. What's the driver behind it? Is it a concern around technology?
I think, Simon, there is a saying by a sort of scientist philosopher called Ray Amara, and he basically said that technology is neither good nor bad.
Yeah.
But it's never neutral. So yeah. I've been watching, you know, technologies for many, many, many years. And the reality of it is that humans have used technologies forever, you know, whether we go back to the axe and flint or the birth of fire. Language is a technology. Our systems of government is a technology. And that's how we've succeeded on the planet. It's also how we have probably pushed the envelope on the planet a little bit too far. And the reality of it is, I firmly believe that human existence is only going to continue on this planet if we are smart about using the technologies we've used. We know that we're never going to manage climate change unless we tech our way out of it. We've got massive improvements in things like healthcare, poverty. As people like Steven Pinker would say, humans have never had it so good. But the reality of it is these technologies, all technologies, can be used for negative and nefarious purposes. And it really is up to us as broader humanity, whether that's through representation through government or communities in general. It's up to us to determine how these technologies are used. And that's what we've got to take back, because certainly in the digital space, we've been asleep at the wheel, and we've allowed commercial purposes to take it on, because that's what companies do. Companies want to make money. So yeah.
So have you got it sounds like your work with Brave Conversations is a democratic impulse that you want to kind of engage people from all walks of life. What happens in your Brave Conversations? How's that kind of structured? What goes on there?
So Brave Conversations came out of work that I did 20 years ago when I was with Fuji Xerox, and we were doing research into what was called the semantic web, which is basically the web we're living in now. And what we were finding is that there was a disconnected community of people who were trying to understand the impact of these technologies on society, but they weren't talking to each other. So we had lawyers and librarians and archivists and scientists and policymakers and journalists. And so what we chose to do at our very first event, which was very imaginatively called the Metadata Conference, because we couldn't think of another name. We did that in 2008, and the idea was to bring people together in order to genuinely have a conversation. So we didn't want academic papers. We didn't want people trying to sell product. We just wanted to have a conversation. And we did 4 of these. And then one of the people who was on our organizing committee said to me, "Oh, you should find this little community called Web Science." And I'd never heard of Web Science. And this was a group of researchers from around the world, including the inventors of many of these technologies: Tim Berners-Lee, Nigel Shadbolt, Wendy Hall, Jim Hendler. And these people were very concerned, and they had started to look at how to do investigation into the evolution of the web, and they called it Web Science. And so I met Wendy Hall, and when I met Wendy, I said, "Look, the world cannot wait for somebody to do an academic piece of work, and 5 years later it's on a shelf, and 5 years later somebody else might integrate it into something practical." I said, "The world can't wait for that. We need to act." And that's what Brave Conversations came about. So what we did is we took this metadata conference, we combined it with the Web Science, we started partnering with the Web Science Trust, and they are conversations. So we get people from all walks of life. We've had events where we've had 3 generations there, grandparents, kids. We get scientists, non-scientists, we get policy people. There are no formal presentations. And what we do is we structure conversations in groups. So we very much use process of group dynamics. And we give them some guided conversations in order for them to walk away, we hope, feeling slightly more empowered and slightly more digitally savvy, a slightly smarter human when it comes to how they use technology.
And that's really interesting. And what are the kind of core themes you're hearing from people? What's kind of coming out of these conversations?
Well, obviously at the minute, and given that we've done 22 of them around the world now, ever since 2017, we did the first Brave Conversations in Canberra in Australia. They very much reflect what is sort of happening in the world around it. So we've had everything from, politics and riots. We've had the war in Ukraine, which was very present last year, and then how the technology is impacting the war in Ukraine. And the last one we held in Brussels about a month ago, obviously it was ChatGPT and artificial intelligence And being in Brussels, it was also talking a lot about the legislation that the European Union is currently putting in.
Yeah.
So I think at the minute I would say that the zeitgeist, if I was to sort of call it that,
Hmm.
is there is a lot of fear. There is a lot of fear out there. There's also excitement on the part of the techies. They're terribly excited. But there is a lot of fear with people because all of a sudden they are using particularly GPT and they're going, oh, this is great. I can go and, I can write my university essay, or if I'm a coder, I can get it to correct my code. But then we're also seeing companies saying, well, okay, well, now we're not going to need as many people. So we're going to start thinking about rationalizing jobs and
Yeah.
giving some of parts of jobs to people. Impact on the education sector, we're sort of seeing that obviously in the news. A
Hmm.
great deal of concern in the UK, particularly about the impact on obviously the election, which is coming up in the
Yeah.
UK next year, and the US election is really, really people are very worried about.
Yeah, I mean that's just my in my work. I work in all different organizations and sectors and many different countries, and it's technology is just so pervasive. It's part of our everyday lives. It's part of kind of our work lives. It's actually a dominant part of most people's lives. They're dominantly kind of attached to some type of machine. That we are all cyborgs now, really, aren't we? I mean, we got our earphones in, we're plugged in, and we're ready to go from the minute we wake up to kind of the nighttime. And this kind of pervasiveness is actually kind of getting under people's skin. You see it kind of people are kind of are fracturing around it, kind of not finding kind of themselves. I meet a lot of people, and I talk about them being dislocated. There's a kind of a dislocation which is kind of has something to do with this technology. I think we lack some kind of groundedness. I don't know what your experience is.
Oh, I completely agree. The interesting conversation around the AI Act at the minute in the European Union, and in fact around the world, as governments are sort of scrambling to try and deal with what's going on. And I mean, and that it's not that these technologies are suddenly, they haven't suddenly parachuted down from heaven. GPT has been around for years, and it was really that OpenAI released it out onto the web
Yeah,
and made it public that suddenly everybody, oh, goody, I can go and play with this. Um, but there are a lot of conversations happening that the regulation of social media was really missed boat. So when in 2009, when Facebook was trying to buy Instagram, and it went up to the Supreme Court in the US, and the Supreme Court turned around and said, well, we can't regulate an industry that doesn't yet exist. And the reality of it was the industry did exist. It's called the information industry. But the
yeah,
problem is that policymakers, and actually a lot of senior people, really anybody over the age of 35 to 40, has very little understanding of what digital really is. They don't understand what we call like the affordances of the technology, what it enables you to do. And so that opportunity to regulate social media was missed in 2009, and that's really got us to the point where we are now. But we very clearly understand that there is an impact between mental health and social media.
yes,
Um, and so that's why, we think social media is bad. AI is going to be social media on steroids because it's going
mm,
to harvest it all. So I completely agree. And this is what we've been trying to work with people for decades. And I think the challenge is that up until now, the the main argument around regulation was around privacy. So the right to be forgotten, again in the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is led by the EU but is now in the US and Ireland and the UK and Australia and other parts of the world. But young people kind of say, well, what's the point? Privacy doesn't matter. My life's all over the internet anyway. And
yes, yeah,
we've been saying, yes, but you haven't seen the consequences of this yet.
yeah, yeah,
And that's now what's going to happen. So I completely agree. I personally believe that, when this little thing here which, my phone or my watch, as long as it's outside of my body, no governments don't understand how to regulate it. As soon as I have a chip which is under my skin, then suddenly it has to be regulated by medical regulation. And we should have been applying medical regulation
Yes,
as it impacts to everything. We should have been applying this from the outset.
yeah,
And because all of a sudden we should be saying this is going to be impacting our health. It's going to be and in a negative and a positive way.
sure.
But I completely agree, and I think that's the bit that worries me, Simon. I mean, I would say to you, when's the last time you sat at a bus stop and saw somebody mindlessly staring off into space? And that's where creativity and innovation happens. It happens when we are disconnected, when we go for a walk in the forest, when we're in the ocean, and people are so glued to these things now, including me. I'm not going to say I'm better than anyone else, but lots of there's companies now that are having little apps in there. It's like, if you've been on the screen for more than a certain number of hours, we'll turn the screen off, or we'll screen time you, or we'll do whatever else. But at the end of the day, we've got to learn to do it ourselves.
I was going to ask you really that there's like state regulation and European regulation, but there's also self-regulation, isn't there? Like, and I'm wondering how we develop, and I think we need certain regulations at different levels, but really learning from each other, learning together to kind of self-regulate these as parents, as families, as colleagues and workers. I think there's a huge piece of work there.
Well, even things like, there's a couple of points which come to mind, Simon. Like, one is, we understand that one of the reasons that social media is addictive is because it that notion of, somebody likes me, I've got a ping, I've got a this, is constantly stimulating the dopamine and the hippocampus.
Yeah.
So we know there is a physiological effect on our brains.
Yeah.
But the second thing is, okay, so we're beginning to understand that. The second thing is, though, whatever happened to, don't put your, when you sit down, people don't have conversations around the dinner table anymore, and somebody brings a phone. So what happens to just the rules of etiquette?
Yeah.
And that's all social stuff that we can do. This is stuff around being present for each other, and stepping back from this. It actually is primal. It's a primal urge to pick up these things. And when we get to the point, Simon, where they are not external, and you can lock it in a cupboard or put it away. When we get to the point which is not that far away, where we're not just, we're already wearing it on our wrist, but when we get to the point where we've got contact lenses, or we have glasses that are smart glasses and we're wearing them all the time, if we don't learn how to take them off or turn them off, then I'm not going to sit there and go, oh my God, that's terrible for humanity. Maybe it might improve us. I've got no idea. But what we need to do is think about it, and this is what people are not doing. They're not stopping and thinking about it.
No, there's got to be none of this is easy. It is very easy to pick up your phone and kind of when you when you're bored, or kind of when you want a dopamine hit or whatever, and it's very hard not to actually. And it's like, so there has to be kind of a real intentionality around it, and from schools, from kind of society at large. You've just come back. You went to the Leicester conference this year, didn't you?
No, I did. I did Leicester in 2018, but no, I did the Group Relations Conference in India, in Mumbai.
Okay.
Which was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. I was thinking about group relations in this work. I've been doing a couple of online group relations conferences called Networks of Desire, thinking about kind of these issues, and thinking about kind of the relationship between authoritarianism and kind of and technology as well. Thinking about surveillance societies, thinking about how we get caught up in not really being kind of dictated to by an authoritarian sort of figure or state, but by a kind of authoritarian culture, a technological culture.
Yeah, I think I think the group relation stuff is very powerful when it comes to the online. So if I just wind back to the pandemic, when all of a sudden we all zoomed and boomed and did whatever. And again, this is a classic. Zoom had been around since 2011, but everybody suddenly discovered it during the pandemic. So the pandemic has actually sped things up by about 10 years.
Yeah.
But but if we look at how so many events happened online, and this again comes back, to the theory of affordances. So what does the sort of a device like the phone or the screen do? What happened in the education setting, we know, is that students went online, and instead of being given a 5 or 10 minute break to go to the toilet or walk between lecture theatres, they literally went, turn off one, lecture, go to the other. And
Yeah.
I think this is where I learnt a lot by going on as many group relations conferences online as I possibly could. I think I did about 8
Hmm.
during 2020, 2021. Partly it was because I was locked up in Australia and it was the only way I could kind of virtually travel. But I learnt a huge amount about that. Like, if you think about some of the basics that we learn in group relations conferences, things around boundary management,
Yeah.
things around leaving one group and going to another, things around when the event finishes, where normally there would be that crossing the threshold, as Leslie would say, and going back into the real world. You press that little red button, and all of a sudden you're there and you're Pat Malone. And how does that emotionally feel? So
Yeah.
I think there was huge amounts. I used to do. I've done quite a few online events where I literally have said, right, we're going to talk about how we experience interacting with others online, and actually get people to unpack it. And I think there's huge amounts that we did learn during that period, but I'm seeing it's almost like COVID's over. We've all forgotten about it now. Now we're all going to run back and go back to real life because we're so excited about being in real life. But this is also where the new devices, like the virtual reality, Apple's Vision Pro, I think is going to be an absolute game changer.
Yeah.
And because it's going to merge the real world and the virtual world. And now we absolutely need to understand those lessons that we learnt during virtual world time and actively educate people. So I think it's all through education. I think we've got to do a lot more events around how to manage yourself online, how did you manage yourself, and the psychological sort of stuff, taking care of your mental health when you're in the virtual space. And I think we desperately need to do that at the minute.
I think you're right. Are you doing any work internally in organizations? Are organizations buying into this at all? Are they questioning? Because I think you're absolutely right. Like that, we have to learn that, and that has to be kind of and that's not something you can just do on your own. It has to be kind of collective, doesn't it?
It absolutely has to be collective. Look, I'll be really honest and say that, before the pandemic, I was actively trying to seek out people within the group relations community who were trying to work in this space. And there was a guy called David Drabble who's at Tavistock, and there was also Corinne Strauss, and they actually did a thing called the digital. What was it called? Digital lab, or the digital surgery, which they did during COVID, and it was quite interesting because they actually got people to come in who were group relations type people to sort of talk about it. Now, I'm not quite sure where that work's gone, but what I will say is that I don't see many facilitators within the group relations HR world who actually understand anything about tech.
No,
And
I
and
agree. I think it's a big
I
lack.
think I think there's a big gap there. And in fact, to be honest, in Mumbai, I tried to bring some techie stuff in, and I could see the consultant was like doing a bit of a head spin, and not really understanding how to embrace the fact. I mean, and just to finish that point, what struck me in Mumbai was I suddenly had this realization that we have the unconscious, which works, everywhere, but it also works within the conference and small groups, and obviously how it manifests in ourselves. But we now have a digital unconscious.
Yeah.
So I tried to bring that in to the GRC in Mumbai, and that was way too much. That was way too much for them.
Mm.
I would love to see, certainly the work that Corinne and David have been doing. And people were very interested in that. I think, again, we got to the end of COVID and everybody got a bit bored and everybody sort of said, oh, I don't want to do this. But I know that, Leslie, there are people at Tavistock who are actively doing more in this space, but it is taking an awful lot of time to get out, I think. And that's kind of normal. Things take time, but the problem is we don't have the time.
No, and I think there's a gap there. I think there's a gap there between being digitally savvy and but there's also kind of a way of thinking which is Bart's kind of what people talk about: boundaries, authority, role, and task. And this came out of 1950s thinking. It came out of the factory, the office, the kind of where we had very structured environments. You had careers, you had clear roles, clear tasks, get some clear boundaries, and that the idea was that gave you containment. In today's world, I'm working with kind of ideas around what I call NIPI, which is networks, identity, power, and influence, because we have to kind of try and find containment in a different way. It's no good kind of thinking it's going to go back to some kind of a fixed boundary. That's not going to happen anymore. Things are kind of too fluid, and I think we have to find new ways of finding containment for this kind of digital age.
Simon, I completely agree, and I think this is where again, one of the exercises we do in Brave Conversations is, and I've mentioned it a couple of times in this conversation, is all around the theory of affordances, which is J.J. Gibson. So very, very simple to explain. If I give you a glass or a cup, and if I gave it to you, what would you do with it? The reality of it is you would take it in your hand, you would drink the liquid, you would put it on the table. We've spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years evolving a cup or a container for water.
Yeah.
The iPhone came on the market 15 years ago. So it actually is kind of ridiculous to think that we would suddenly in 15 years know how to deal with these devices, let alone this completely different way of managing information behind it. And that's the challenge that we as humans have got, which is that it takes us at least a generation, 25 to 30 years to figure out what to do with things. And at the minute, everything's moving so fast, we don't have time to do this. And so I think that this is where a lot of the work that I do, and certainly what drives both Brave Conversations, but the work that I do through the charity and partner organisations that we have is to be working with young people under 35, who have been born into this digital world, who are not necessarily digitally savvy themselves. Let me tell you, a lot of them are pretty stupid. But the reality of it is that we've watched the evolution of this. So you and I are the last generation to remember life before the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty amazing thought.
Yeah.
So the question then I ask about that is, what do we want to lose and what do we want to keep? And I think that's why Brave Conversations, that's why, the work that we've been doing. I mean, I've been very fortunate in that I had 3 coaches from Solstrand, which is the Norwegian business school. It's the Norwegian leadership program, which is based on the whole group relations methodology. And actually, it's been going since 1962 and it's been going for 70 years. I think it's the best leadership program in the world. And it's been great because last year I went and presented to one of the Solstrand cohorts, did a little mini Brave Conversations. And I would love, I've tried for many years to try and get it into some of these sort of more formal environments. Not that I have to do it, but get other people to start bringing some of this stuff in and bringing younger people in. And we have to amplify it, Simon. I think that's the only way we can do it. It's got to be more than me puddling around doing as much as I can.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real gap is I was talking to somebody about this, and in the tech world, tech people don't have the kind of the people skills and a depth knowledge of kind of they need, and they're designing all the tech, and in the people world, kind of they don't have the tech skills, so there's this gap between the two.
And you're right, and that's actually what web science tried to actually bring that together, because web science by definition was the social sciences and computer science. So for you to
Yeah,
do a
yeah.
master's or PhD, you had to actually do both. And the challenge in the academic world is that social scientists don't get much funding. They speak at different conferences. They use different language to computer scientists. But web science managed to do that, I think, very well. But what it hasn't been able to do, its focus is around academia. But this also brings in the Digital Enlightenment Foundation, or DEF, which
Hmm.
I'm now president of, and I've taken over that from the original founders who created this little organization 10 years ago. And the objective was to work with policy people in the European Union. It's very European based, um, and it's achieved a lot of things because it's had a huge impact in coming up, influencing some of the legislation. It's got some very interesting partnerships. And one of the things that I want to do now with DEF and the team that we're working with, who have taken over, is to sort of amplify Brave Conversations, to start taking the work that we've been doing with web science, but actually start taking it through the DEF networks and making it much more mainstream. And I think that's sort of part of where we need to go and what we need to do, because one thing that we do in Brave Conversations is we sit the techies down at the same table as mum and dad who might
Yeah.
be off the street, and we basically say to the techies, you have to explain to these people what you're doing, and they get
Mm.
very frustrated. You've got to remember that the majority of people who are writing the tech, to be honest, are male, European, and have slight Asperger's, and
Yeah.
there is psychological data for that. But this also links to certainly the work that I'm doing with Founders and Coders in the UK. And Founders and Coders was the first free code academy, which was started in the UK. And we bring people into our program, and they're normally kind of mid-20s, and they're doing a career change, and a lot of them come from the social sciences. So
Interesting.
I think bringing that together is another thing, so that you're bringing people who want to develop code, but they already come in being a musician or an artist or a journalist or whatever. And again, we're just quietly puddling along with our little 12 apprentices per cohort. But the more organizations that really look to diversify people who are coming into tech, and the more um, we try and give sort of even basic tech skills to the average person, I think the better.
Yeah, this is really interesting work you're doing, and I'm really pleased you're doing it. I think we need to have another conversation about how to design a group relations conference together and bring in some colleagues like Nicola Rayford Howard and others I know are very interested in it, in the tech piece as well as the kind of the group relations piece. I think
Oh,
there's a
I
good
would
thing to do there.
do that in a heartbeat. And but the interesting thing is, I'd challenge you to say what we should do is do it so that it's hybrid.
Yeah, yeah,
And we do, there is a wonderful wonderful quote, which is Jim Collins, who wrote some very great leadership books. And in Good to Great, he said the definition of entrepreneurship is the tyranny of the or and the power of the and.
hmm,
And I firmly believe now that we are digital beings. We live our lives both in the real world and the virtual world. We're going to continue to do this, and the potential of this is unbelievably exciting if we can get it right. So we
yeah.
have to think about the um, and that's the exciting bit. That's kind of part of what
Sure,
gets me up in
sure.
the morning, doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, this has been really interesting, Annie. We're coming to an end. I ask guests before they leave the show. I ask them two questions. Your reflections on what it means to live a good life and what it means to create a good society.
Fantastic questions. To live a good life, when I describe myself as a philanthropist, philanthropist means love of humanity,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe humans are innately good, but we are also part of the whole ecosystem. And the Australian Aboriginals believe in the rainbow spirit, and the fact that we humans aren't really any more important than anyone else is, or anything else is in the world. And so I think to live a good life is to be humble and to realize the great power that we as humans have, but with that power comes the responsibility of stewarding and shepherding the environment and our societies. And I think we can do that. But I think humility, grace, and understanding that, at the end of the day, we're only part of the great chain of being. And what we need to do is leave the world a better place than we found it.
Very good thoughts. Thank you very much, Anne. It's been lovely talking to you. Keep up the great work.
Will do. Okay, thanks, Simon.
Bye.